Welcome to this Chem Safety webinar on asbestos for managers. My name is Sam McGee. I am a Senior Occupational Hygiene Consultant and Occupational Hygiene Team Leader at Chem Safety. And I've been working with asbestos and advising clients on how to manage asbestos for over the last 10 years. If you're watching this webinar live, there's a Q&A tab at the bottom of the screen, and you can post any questions which I'll try to answer at the end. Our details will also be on a follow-up email, which will include a link to the recording of today's session and some online resources. So yeah, let's move on to the presentation. Coming to you live from our Wellington offices today in Petone. So today we're going to cover asbestos for managers is our topic. So we're going to cover asbestos in New Zealand, like how, where was, why was it used, when was it used, the legislation relevant to asbestos in New Zealand, the sector overall in New Zealand, because there's a lot of different parts to it, and it can be quite hard for someone who isn't intimately familiar to understand where they need to go and what professionals to see. Duties for managers in some specific cases, and what is good practice, and some common mistakes we encounter too, and some solutions around it. Now, I could go hours on each of these topics. It's just an introduction to all of them, and we're going to work on something a bit more in depth later on. So, asbestos in New Zealand. It's naturally occurring around the world. It's a rock. There's types you may have heard of: white, brown, and blue asbestos. There's actually 3 more types, but white, brown, and blue, amosite, chrysotile, and chrysotolite are the 3 main types that you'll find in any building products. It's naturally occurring in New Zealand with significant deposits found in Golden Bay, so Cobb River area, and it was mined from 1941 to 1963, so it wasn't actually that long ago that we're still mining it. And also in Southwestland, the Red Hills area, where we're exploring the possibility of continuing to starting a new mine in the 1970s. So again, that's only 50 years ago, not that long at all. We had 2 large factories that made asbestos-containing products, fibre cement products, one in Auckland and one in Christchurch. The majority of the asbestos was imported from overseas, and this really started in bulk after World War II. That's when most of the asbestos started coming into the country. It was a little bit before, but nowhere near the same scale. We started to ban asbestos products in stages. So we banned the importation of raw brown and blue asbestos in 1984. The ban of raw white asbestos came in 1999, and the ban of importation of asbestos-containing materials was only in October 2016. So it's 6-7 years ago, not long at all. So we started to decrease the use of asbestos in our building products from the 1980s, but it was still used in the 90s and even in some 2000s products as well. So where is asbestos in buildings? Where would you find it? If it's wood, metal, or glass, you're probably fine. Anything else, there's a decent chance. So most buildings constructed prior to 1990 and a lesser percentage of them after 1990. So fibre cement products, we're talking Super 6 roof, cement board, gables, millboards, sort of, not quite fibre cement, but close enough. Fencing, gutters, these can all be fibre cement products, and they can quite likely contain asbestos. We've got bitumen products. Typically in a household, it might just be some window weatherproofing around a window or something like that, or an acoustic pad under a sink. But in commercial or apartment style buildings, flat roofs with bitumen layer on it could be asbestos containing. Anything designed to insulate hot pipework or a heated process, so ropes, gaskets, laggings, all those sort of things are quite likely to contain asbestos. We've also got plaster products, so stipple ceilings, lava and plaster walls, plaster skim coats on rendered smooth walls, concrete walls, stopping compound within plasterboard sheets, all quite frequently contain asbestos. Resinous products, in this case, we're talking things such as the switchboard, the black resin switchboard that you'll see in most houses. That black resinous product is asbestos containing. And then we've got vinyl products and the adhesive used to stick them down. So we used to have a rough rule of thumb that the uglier the vinyl, the more likely it was to contain asbestos. And that holds relatively true. There are many more applications of asbestos, and once again, more likely in commercial than in residential, but still still everywhere. Brake pads, stage curtains, old ironing board covers, gaskets, clutches. There's lots of places that we can find asbestos, and the list unfortunately keeps growing and growing as we discover more. Post-2000s, it's less likely to be present, but we have found it occasionally in things like bituminous products or gaskets. So if you're unsure, it's still best to get it tested. Now, we all know asbestos is bad for you. It is a confirmed carcinogen. Most of the focus on asbestos health effects in New Zealand are on the three most common ones that we come across, which is asbestosis. This is a scarring or thickening of lung tissue. We've got lung cancer, pretty self-explanatory there, and mesothelioma. This is a cancer of the mesothelial tissue, which is a lining around our lungs and some of our other organs. Some other health effects that asbestos can cause are pleural plaques and cancers of the larynx and ovary. So it's estimated around 220 people die each year from exposure to asbestos and asbestos-related diseases in New Zealand. And New Zealand has averaged over 100 new cases of mesothelioma a year since 2016. It's likely that the overall health burden is significantly larger than this, and that some of this is getting underreported. Most of these diseases take a long time from exposure to have the effect on the body. We can be at the shorter end, 5 years, up to 40, 50 plus from when you've been exposed to the asbestos to when the health effect may occur. So, legislation relevant to asbestos, one of the key things in this presentation. So the primary document is the Health and Safety at Work Act. This was introduced after the Pike River accident. We needed to rework our health and safety laws. So the Health and Safety at Work Act 2015, or HSWA, was introduced. And this is the main bit of legislation. This talks about the general overall health and safety in New Zealand. So it's your hazard hierarchy, eliminating your risks to health and safety, etc. Then we've got some specific controls that are relevant to asbestos. And if you're managing asbestos on site, you need to have a good understanding of all of these. So we have the Health and Safety at Work asbestos regs, also introduced in 2016, very specific about some requirements that are relating to asbestos. But also we have the Health and Safety at Work General Risk and Workplace Management regs, or VRIM regs. So I'll say for the rest of the presentation when they come up. And these are more general hazard regulations, but they do also apply to the asbestos side of things. And then finally, it's not quite legislation, but it's definitely very important and something you need to know, which is the Management and Removal of Asbestos Approved Code of Practice, or Asbestos ACOP, shorthand. It's an outline of ways that you can comply with the asbestos regulations. You don't have to follow that. You can choose alternative ways, but you have to prove that they're safe. We're going to go over some of the specific duties in more detail later on. But yeah, significant. You need to know these documents if you're going to be managing asbestos on your sites. So moving on to the next slide. So the sector in New Zealand, it's actually quite a complicated sector. Although relatively small, there are a lot of individual subgroups. Some people do some things in asbestos, but the rest of the things in other areas. So as you can see here, we've got lots of different subsectors, and even more than this too. Might have to get the whole thing up. Oh, too many. So we'll cover removalists, removalists, assessors, and surveyors in greater detail. But to effectively manage asbestos, you need to have an understanding of all these subsectors and how they relate to each other. You'll probably have to deal with them if you're an asbestos manager for a large site of properties on a daily or weekly basis. There can be some overlap in some of these subgroups, which at times can be beneficial and other times is not best practice and almost a conflict of interest. So we'll go over some of that as well. So what we do at Chem Safety is we are consultants, we're assessors, we are surveyors, we do training, and we're an analysis laboratory. So we cover a good chunk of it, but there's definitely more to it than that. So some of the ones that we won't go in detail here are contaminated land specialists. So when you've got asbestos in soil, along with those other regulations and the ACOP that I showed you before, there's the brands guidelines for asbestos in soils in New Zealand. These contaminated land specialists will follow these guidelines. They're typically environmental engineers that will be doing this. Then there's certain percentages of asbestos you can have in soil at given points, depending on the land use and the type of asbestos and the depth, etc., that it is found. So they've also got to comply with the Resource Management Act. It's a separate set of skills, so often they're separate from the rest of them, but sometimes they can also be a surveyor or assessor as well. We've got analysis labs, so they are throughout the country. They need to be IANZ accredited, which is to ISO 17025. There are currently 19 labs in New Zealand with this accreditation. They can do analysis of bulk samples of building materials for asbestos, soil samples, and sometimes air samples as well. So fibre counting. These air samples don't have to be IANZ accredited, but this is ideal, best practice. We've also got suppliers. So these are companies, sometimes there's general health and safety suppliers, general trade suppliers, or sometimes they are specific asbestos suppliers. These will provide things like PPE, waste bags, decontamination equipment like HEPA vacuums, and they'll service and provide the extra wraparound services that are required with these products as well. Then we have trainers. So these people train the removalists and the assessors. They can also undertake asbestos-related work training, so we can train your workers to do some asbestos duties, or just general asbestos awareness training. Now, there are some specific removal unit standards for the NZQA system for removalists and assessors, but asbestos-related work and awareness are more general training. We have plenty of associations as well that are involved with asbestos. So we've got FAMANZ, the Faculty of Asbestos Management Australia and New Zealand, and they're like a advocate group and a representative body for removalists and consultants, so surveyors, assessors, etc. We've got the NZDAA, New Zealand Demolition and Asbestos Association, and they represent consultants, removalists, and demolition companies. And then finally, we've got ARCANZ, Asbestos Removal Contractors Association of New Zealand, and they are there for removalists as well. There are also other parties that haven't even made the slide that are involved. We've got WorkSafe. They help inform the asbestos regulations. They're part of the licensing for removalists and assessors. They've got an asbestos team as well. We've got IANZ there. We mentioned them with the labs. They are the lab accreditation body within New Zealand. So they meet the certain standards. It's all about quality control. We've got occupational health professionals, so physicians and nurses. So they'll deal with the fallouts of having asbestos-related illnesses, as well as the regular asbestos medicals that are required by some parts of the legislation. We have health and safety generalists. A good chunk of you probably are health and safety, advisors, managers at your companies. So you have to deal with asbestos on your sites as well, and the general principles of health and safety do apply to asbestos. Also, we've got waste operators and councils. So once the asbestos is removed, these are the organisations that will help decide where it goes and how it needs to get there. You can't just go chuck it down to your local tip in most cases. So, surveyors. These are often the first professionals approach when you realise I need some help with asbestos. They're going to do a survey or an audit and try and identify the asbestos on the property. So they need to know the types and locations of asbestos-containing materials in a building. Where are they likely to be? Where would you expect to find them? They need to know how to eliminate and minimise exposure risk, because to take a sample, it's not something where we can just put a piece of paper on it and it'll change colour, telling us whether it's asbestos or not. We've actually got to take a piece of that sample and take it away to the laboratory where they'll look at it under microscopes. So they need to know how to safely take samples to reduce the risk of exposure to themselves and to other people potentially in the building or that will be using the building afterwards. They need to be able to act independently with impartiality and integrity. So if a client gets someone in to do asbestos survey and they've made it clear they don't really want to find asbestos because there's going to be a lot of extra time and money to remove it, you want the surveyor to be able to stand by their ground and say, look, there was asbestos here, and not just, forget to mention that in the report. So they need to be suitably trained and to know their limitations. So within New Zealand, the common surveying qualifications are things called the IP 402, which is a British weekish long course when you have some experience on asbestos surveying. We've got the IP 405, which is a how to manage asbestos in buildings, same sort of series. There's about 5 or 6 of that series, moving from things like bulk analysis, etc. But those are the 2 main relevant ones for surveyors. There's also the W504 course, once again provided by the British, and it's more general asbestos health and safety knowledge. Due diligence is required to ensure you get a suitable surveyor. Because there is no register of competent surveyors within the country, we often get called in where a client has gotten a surveyor in, and either the removalist or they've looked over it and it's not adequate, like they've missed a lot of stuff or they haven't provided the right information, and we get called in to try and help and remediate that situation. You can be INS accredited for asbestos surveying, so you're meeting some strict quality standards there. Only 2 companies in New Zealand currently have this. One of them is Chem Safety. And representative bodies that include surveyors as FAMANS and the NZDAA. So there's no specific register for surveyors, and surveyors can also hold a lot of other responsibilities. So, a surveyor could be a consultant. They could also be an assessor. They could be both. Surveyors can be removalists, but a removalist shouldn't be an assessor. And sometimes it is best practice to have your surveyor be the consultant and the assessor for the job. That way they know the project from start to go. Although removalists can survey, it's typically not ideal to have a removalist be the surveyor for your site. There is an inherent conflict of interest there because they want to find more asbestos. Maybe it's not there, so that there's more chance of them doing the removal work. Not that removalists can't be great surveyors, but it's probably better that they're surveying jobs that they're not going to be the removalist for. So, talking about removalists, there are 230 different removal companies currently on the WorkSafe register. 96 of them have both Class A and B licenses, and 134 have only Class A licenses, Class B. So Class A is friable asbestos removal. This friable asbestos is asbestos that can be removed. Friable asbestos is asbestos that when it's damaged, or even when it's not damaged, it has a higher potential of releasing fibres. And these asbestos fibres are what leads to the health effects that we talked about earlier. The Class B is for non-friable asbestos only. And non-friable is asbestos that is bound in a rigid matrix. So products like cement boards or certain bitumen or resinous products. These products, even when damaged, are unlikely to release significant quantities of asbestos fibres. So therefore, some less stringent controls are required when removing Class B products. If a removalist is a Class A asbestos, has a Class A license, they must have a certified safety management system that is accredited with ASNZS 4801, Occupational Health and Safety Management Systems. So they've got to have some systems in place and they've got to know what they're doing. They must have registered competent supervisors on site during Class A removal work. There are training courses to become a removalist in New Zealand, and their representative bodies include FAMANS, NZDA, and ARCAN, so they've got quite a lot there. Removalists have a lot of specific duties within the asbestos legislation. So they need to restrict access to removal areas. They need to ensure the supervisor is present. They need to train their workers on how to remove asbestos safely, the health effects from that. They need to inform relevant parties about the asbestos removals and give appropriate info to them about their risks and what is going to happen. So that could be they need to tell the neighbours that they're going to be removing a roof on the property next door. They might need to tell other subcontractors on site. It really depends on the site. They need to prepare an asbestos removal control plan. So this is effectively how they're going to remove the asbestos from blow to go. They need to notify WorkSafe of removal at least 5 working days prior to doing the removal. There are some exemptions in particular emergency demolition type jobs, but they're very few and far between. If the air monitoring that the assessors do exceeds the levels set out within the legislation, it's the removalist's job to notify WorkSafe if there's an exceedance. They need to stop work and they need to do certain things depending on the level of the exceedance. They need to ensure that suitable decontamination facilities are in place, and they need to ensure that clearance inspections are undertaken. Now, they have other duties as well, but what's interesting here is that most of the things that require an assessor, the actual duty within the legislation is on the removalist to make sure that the assessor does it, which is quite interesting. So speaking of assessors, they're another category we'll go a bit more deep on. Once again, they've got a WorkSafe register like the removalist, so you can go onto WorkSafe's website and see your assessors, also known as licensed asbestos assessors or LAAs. There are currently 293 on the register all throughout the country. Ideally, these should be engaged by the PCBU, so the persons conducting business or undertaking. so the main company, rather than being engaged by the removalists themselves, although often this is the case where they're engaged by the removalists because the PCBU doesn't want to have to onboard another contractor into their system. But that leads to a potential conflict of interest, because the removalist is at that point, the assessor is then getting paid by the removalist, even though the final money is probably coming from the primary contractor. So ideally, and it is the PCBU's job to engage the assessor in a commercial situation. For Class A work, there must be an independent licensed assessor, so it can't be an assessor within the removal company. And for Class B, they need to be an independent, competent person. So they don't need to be an assessor to give a clearance certificate for Class B work. Most are, though. They need to be suitably trained and to know their limitations, so know what they can do, what they can't do, what's beyond their scope and their experience. Their representative bodies include FAMANS and the NZDAA. So assessors have only been around since the 2016 regs. Previously, the final sign-off for clearance was done by the removalists themselves. They realised that wasn't the best system, so that was changed in 2016. Assessors are required to undertake monitoring in the regulations. However, the requirement that it gets done is that of the removalist. So assessors have to do it, but removalists are the ones in the legislation with the duty to ensure that it's completed. Often difficulties that assessors face is that previous poor removal work has been undertaken in the past, which means even outside the bubble of the enclosure, there can be quite a high asbestos risk. And as we'll get to later with some of the best practice, there are different ways to deal with these sort of things. So, duties for managers. Before we go into some specific duties, there's a key concept here that we need to make sure we all understand. It's general health and safety concept of overlapping duties. Just because there's one company that has a duty, you might have it as well, so you've both got to work on it together. So in a typical asbestos situation, there can be several parties involved on site. For example, timber processing factory is going to refurbish their sawmill. That means basically stripping it to the bones, new floor print, etc., and building back up. Part of this includes identifying and removing asbestos. So some of the stakeholders include the factory and all its staff, project management consultancy that was hired to oversee the project, the primary contractor for the construction of the place and all their subcontractors, the demolition company, the asbestos removal company, the asbestos consultants and assessors that have been used on this project, and the contaminated land consultants, and there could be many more as well. So all these various PCBUs have duties under the Health and Safety at Work Act. So when there are overlapping duties, the businesses must, as far as reasonably practical, consult, cooperate, and coordinate those 3 Cs with those other businesses that they share those overlapping duties with. This typically involves planning ahead. So you're going to identify the health and safety risks from the tasks that you're planning to do. You're going to come up with plans to manage and control these risks collectively that you agree upon. Then you're going to be clear about which businesses have duties and who needs to do what in regards to those risks. Is it all going to be on the asbestos removal list? They just have to inform the other parties, or is there going to be other is the demolition company going to have to do some of this themselves? And a business just can't simply, wipe their hands off it, say, I'm not an asbestos company, I'm not dealing with this, it's not my problem. If they've got duties to protect their workers, so they need to be doing their due diligence and all those sort of steps as well. So even though most of you guys are probably primary contractors, working for the businesses, you have duties. You can't just say it's all the project management firm, they're handling all the health and safety. I'm sure most of you know that already. So we'll go through the duties you might have at various stages. So at the start or before the start of the project. When you're scoping out the project, we have a duty to manage risks to health and safety by elimination in the first instance, and if not able to do that, via the minimization techniques. So that hazard hierarchy, substitution, isolation, engineering controls, administration, PPE, going down that route. We also have a primary duty of care. So we must ensure, as far as reasonably practical, that the health and safety of workers on the site, we're caring for them, and activities that our workers are doing, being cared for as well. So one of the first things you're probably going to do when you come up with the idea, actually, this might involve some asbestos, is you're going to need to identify the asbestos. And there are specific duties for businesses that have buildings constructed prior to 2000, or January 1st, 2000, that you need to identify the asbestos within the workplace. So a PCBU with management or control of a workplace who knows or ought to reasonably know that there is a risk of exposure to asbestos fibres in the workplace must ensure, as far as reasonably practical, that all asbestos or ACM giving rise to the risk at the workplace is identified. What this means effectively is that you need to have a survey. So all commercial businesses that have buildings prior to 2000 at this point in time should have an asbestos management survey undertaken, and they should have an asbestos management plan. Now, we realise this isn't the case, but if you're following the legislation, that does need to happen. Or have assumed everything contains asbestos, but then you still need the plan, and that's honestly a lot more work than it sounds. So surveys, what type of survey do you need? Well, if you're doing this sort of work, like a big refurbishment project, you're going to need a refurbishment survey or a demolition survey. So the difference between a management survey and refurb or demolition surveys is management surveys only deal with asbestos products that are likely to be damaged through just general occupancy, surface level products. That's not intrusive. It doesn't particularly go into wall cavities or into internal parts of components. It's just the surface level stuff, and it may not even be sampled. It could be presumed to contain asbestos if the consultant was relatively sure. Typically for a project, you're going to require a refurbishment survey, which is a management plus more detail on the area that's been refurbished, or if the building's going to be knocked down, a demolition survey, which is effectively a whole building refurbishment survey. These surveys are intrusive. Wall linings, floor coverings, cavities are explored, ceiling spaces, roof spaces, extensive sampling, lots of damage to the structure. After a survey, demolition refurb survey has been completed, the building won't be occupiable. It won't necessarily be safe or suitable for occupation after that point. This is where a big chicken egg comes in. The company wants to know the asbestos first, but they don't want to empty the project because they're trying to get some costs, empty the building because they want to get the costs for the project later on, but you can't actually find out all the asbestos until the building is empty, but by that stage you don't know the costs. So it's a endless catch-22 that tends to be difficulties for lots of businesses. At the start, you might want to think about engaging with the other bodies that you might need to. So neighbours, if you've got a lot of, particularly for exterior products or roof products, Super 6 roofs, got some neighbours close by, getting them on board initially so they don't start raising concerns once the project starts can make it a lot simpler for you. If you're going to need to remove something in a non-prescribed way, you might want to consider talking to WorkSafe and assessors, consultants, and figuring out a best practice how you're going to manage this. Contractor selection. So, often you're considering things like cost, expertise, availabilities, the methodology. It's really good if you don't have an in-house asbestos person to hire a consultant to be part of your review panel for picking your asbestos removalist, for example. You're also going to want to think about contingencies. So what happens if the demolition survey missed something, which does happen? There's only so much concrete one can get through that hard demolition will discover. What are you going to do in those situations? Because it can add significant time and cost to a project. What are you going to do if there's high asbestos readings for the surveillance monitoring that you have to stop work? What's your plan? Who are you going to communicate that? What happens if media becomes interested in this? If there's typically it's more situations like schools or hospitals, how are you going to manage that? So there's all these sort of duties and things that come up when managing these projects. So during the project, we have a bunch of duties as well. If you're the primary contractor, the PCBU that owns the business, you're going to just have to keep general oversight over the whole project. Everyone else will be doing their job smoothly as you agreed, but things develop, people take shortcuts. Is there a new method of removal being used? Are they try to speed up the process because something's got behind? Are they suggesting using compressed air or water blasting? As those things on asbestos products are explicitly forbidden within the legislation. So keeping an oversight of what's going on, whether it's weekly meetings for anyone involved with the asbestos, or you've engaged a second independent assessor to just review, not the day-to-day stuff, they're not undertaking the clearances or the surveillance, but they come once or twice a week just to observe, and second independent set of eyes that report directly to you, and they don't actually undertake the clearance works themselves. So I've been involved with multiple projects where that's the case, and that's worked quite well. Sometimes as the person that's had the independent person come in and check what I'm doing, other times as that second independent or doubly independent person. Communication and collaboration is key. So when something changes or goes wrong, making sure it goes all the way up and down the chain, making sure you're getting the clearance certificates. Are they going to the right people? Are people aware of what's going on? Keeping an eye on what the surveillance monitoring levels are. Are they acceptable? Are they increasing? Is there trends that you can see here? Checking if the asbestos removal control plan is available and up to date. You're going back and just double checking some of the duties under the regulations. And if something changes, going back to that Health and Safety at Work Act thing of, are you eliminating the risks to your health and safety? Or are you minimizing risks to health and safety? Okay, moving on to the next slide. I see some people have raised their hands and got some questions. We'll get to those at the end of the presentation. After the project, we got duties as well. Just because the removal has been completed, your new shiny building is there, we've still got duties under the asbestos regulations. So you're going to have to, if you're a contractor building something, you might have to hand over back to the primary business. So how are you going to prepare that handover? Reviewing the asbestos management plan, making sure it's up to date, because a lot of asbestos has been removed. Some of it may have changed conditions, some may now be encapsulated. There's a lot of things here that need to be updated to give back to the business. If it's a change from one business to another, the responsibility of the PCBU who owns the site, they need to hand over that information to the new PCBU. It can be a lot easier if the consultants and assessors that were doing the clearances were also involved in the updating of the management plan as it goes, rather than having to hire a new bunch of consultants to go through, review everything and update it. It's a lot more work in that case. Keeping records, so you'll need to keep records of your asbestos clearance certificates, etc. Any health monitoring that you needed to undertake for your workers. The health stuff could be 40 years. Depending on the nature of the documents, anywhere between that 5 and 40 years, you need to keep some of this stuff for. And it could be repeating work. You might only have done phase 1 and phase 2 is similar, so you need to keep that collaboration going. So what is good practice? I thought we'd talk through a case study. This is a merging of some things that have occurred in the past, so I'm trying to keep it a bit vague. A series of large commercial buildings are going to be demolished completely, and a new residential development is going to be built up on this land. So how are you going to handle the asbestos? What is a good way to handle this asbestos situation for this project? So often you get the surveyor in first. Sometimes if a survey has been completed, you might get an assessor, and it's about getting the professionals in on the right duty. Often they'll get a demo company and a removal company in, and then they'll gauge the assessors and the surveys, and that's typically not the right way to go about it, especially as the assessors are your advocate for the asbestos on the site. It's good to get them in first, along after having completed the survey. Can be the same person, and they can help with your contractor selection process in regards to the asbestos requirements. The buildings were occupied and you didn't want to fully get rid of all the people first, because there's a long time in terms of planning this project. So you opted to do a management survey first, realizing the limitations of this, but it did give you some idea of what the asbestos was on site. And then closer to the time, once the building was vacated, you did a demolition survey to find out if there was any more or less asbestos, with some contingencies in your plan for that. You then tender for the asbestos removal after the demolition survey is completed, so the removalists who are going for the tender know what asbestos to find and what you're sort of expecting as part of that. Once the removalist has been chosen and they've created the removal plan, the removalist, the assessor, and you as the PCBU come up with a surveillance strategy. So what air monitoring are you going to be doing in or around the removal projects to make sure that your workers, the other contractors on site, are safe, and the neighbours. You'll be consulting with the community around you. Neighbours get very concerned when they see people walking in and out of white removal suits, asbestos removal gear. So you want to help explain the risk to them. You can offer them guidance, training, and advice. Show them the techniques, whether you're doing dust depression, misting, it's all double enclosed. You've built a big shrink wrap, secondary enclosure around everything to help relieve their concerns, and giving them a contact so they know who they can contact if they have concerns. So the removal starts, and as what unfortunately is often the case, not all the asbestos could be safely removed. So you have to come up with a process of how to remove that, how you're going to manage that asbestos going forward. It was encapsulated, it was sprayed, it was labelled, and then the management plan was updated for when they handed over to the new company, the construction company that was going to be land on the site, how they're going to handle some of the asbestos within the soil / concrete slab that was remaining. And then making sure at the end, when you hand over to the, let's say, the construction team with their supposedly clean site, that they know about the asbestos that is remaining and their responsibilities in regards to it, especially if the project changes or scope creep happens. So, some common mistakes we encounter on site. Lots of times, especially for bigger commercial projects, they've only got a management survey done, which has only done those surface areas of the building. And therefore, when the demolition starts, they start uncovering more types of asbestos, and often that adds significant cost and time to the project. Particularly as the stuff that's often found in demolition projects is not easy to remove and can be more often not friable, which is the more hazardous and difficult asbestos to deal with. Other shortcuts that companies end up taking is they try to get a demolition level survey done while the building is occupied. It's just not possible to do a full demolition survey while a building is occupied. The building has to be de-energized to do it safely. So that means electricity, any high pressure systems, all those things disconnected and de-energized. Realistically, the building can't be occupied to do this. You know, we're intrusively going through wall cavities, going through floors going into ceilings, creating access where there isn't access to rooms. Yeah, it's just not suitable to have people in it. So if you had a demolition survey done while it was occupied, it's likely there is asbestos that has been not discovered yet. Even with a full proper demolition survey, sometimes things just can't be accessed until you're getting a bulldozer through the building. So, you've got to understand that too. Not engaging with the neighbours or other concerned bodies, especially if there's something like a school nearby, parents, and then it becomes a media thing. If you talk to everybody and get upfront about what you're going to do and how you're going to do it, it often leads to a lot less hassle during the project. The contractors or clients not having an understanding of the limitations of asbestos work. So one building I was involved with, large multi-storey concrete building, around each window, about 6 inches into the concrete, there was a bitumen layer in the cast concrete, which had asbestos in it. This wasn't going to be found during any survey, basically only once they got the wrecking ball to start smashing down the building, where they discovered this, and it added lots of time. So knowing that, yes, we've got a demolition survey, we've followed all the best practice, but there are still chances, especially in things like concrete or inside steel, that they just can't find until you get in the hard demo occurring. Another one is often to save on time, especially for multi-floor, multi-stage buildings, that the demolition work is occurring next to the asbestos work. Because the asbestos fibre counting method that's often used for surveillance isn't specific for asbestos fibres, it's a respirable fibre. When demolition work, it creates a lot of vibration, dust, things, and that can lead to high counts and high readings outside the enclosure, which then means the asbestos side has to stop and investigations need to happen. Often the specific monitoring for asbestos, which is a lot more time consuming and expensive, occurs to find out it was just demolition dust. So having your project staged in a way where the asbestos removal can be completed first before the demolition work, it significantly helps reduce those sort of issues. Other situations is that it's typical of projects, there's scope creep or change, which meant that they got a demolition or refurb survey for all the areas that were required. But as the project grew, the scope changed, and suddenly areas that were meant to be surveyed or that needed to be surveyed weren't, and they haven't updated the survey or that sort of planning beforehand. They're just going on with it. Often another thing we come across is that the cheapest price contractors have been selected, saying they can do more and then realizing that they can't, and charging the contractor with lots of variations, which increase time and lead to resentment all around. So now we'll have time for some questions. So I'll open up the Q&A. Feel free to start writing them now if you haven't already. Okay, see I've got a few here. What was the main reason for using asbestos? Great question there. asbestos was used, it has lots of good properties, and it's still used in many parts of the world because it is a fantastic building material. It was used for its fire resistance, so it has a high melting point. It's quite strong in regards to fireproofing. There's a lot of fireproof materials and buildings in New Zealand that contain asbestos. And it's also used, it was chemically resistant. It provides tensile strength to some products, so plaster products that stop them from cracking, fiber boards that provided strength to the board, and it was often a good, cheap material. So it was filler, cheaper than some of the other base building materials that were involved. Is Chem Safety IONS accredited? Yes, we are IONS accredited for bulk sample analysis and asbestos surveying and inspection. So I've already answered that question. Couple more moments for any final questions to come through, and obviously if you have other questions, feel free to contact us and email us. I'll just move to the final slide too. So there's some resources available. So our website, in our asbestos section, we've got services and common things we come across and solutions. We also have an asbestos awareness course. It's about 2 hours long. So this can be great for lots of workers on your site. It's just getting an understanding of the asbestos that's there. It's not asbestos related work training. If you want that, it's something we can provide for you, but that's on a case-by-case basis. We're also developing a more in-depth course on this topic, asbestos for managers, which we'll be launching later this year. So in the email we'll send out later, there'll be a link if you want to register your interest for that. We have a large team of consultants, assessors, surveyors, trainers, and analysts that are ready to help solve your asbestos problems. And for some general asbestos information, you've got WorkSafe and HSE, which is the British version of WorkSafe, which have great information on asbestos. So another question, does Chem Safety travel everywhere in New Zealand? Yes, it's been all over the country recently. We've got main bases in Christchurch and Wellington, which we service each of the islands from. We've done surveys from Northland down to Southland and Chatham Islands. We haven't been to Stewart Island yet, but hopefully it'll be something that someone will get to do soon, so we can cover off the whole inhabited part of the country. But yeah, we're frequently everywhere doing surveys. What do I think of the MB self-assessment template? I'm not too familiar with that, so I will get back to you and maybe that follow-up email there. Sorry, Steve. Do Chem Safety act as a consultant if unsure of what contractors are doing / explaining? We do act as consultants, so we don't have to be an assessor, the assessor on the job or the surveyor. We can come in and just provide general asbestos advice, a sounding board for you guys, or to help, that higher level dealing with the asbestos on the site. We can act as independent. We don't need to be doing the daily surveillance on a job or anything like that. We can come in and help train or educate, consult as need be. Alrighty, well, thank you for attending the webinar. There will be a recording of this later for those that can't make it, and a follow-up email too with some more resources and try and answer that question about the self-assessment template. And feel free to join our next webinar next month.